Now, my friends, this didn't happen by accident. This happened by design. Go back to how the EU got off the ground in the 1950s. Go back to the debates that were being held when the leaders of the original member states began to discuss this project for pooling their democracies. They had had a bad experience. They'd just come through the horror of the Second World War. And when they looked back at the war and the plebiscitary democracy that had preceded it, they were a little bit nervous. They thought that, left to their own devices, voters might make terrible mistakes. They might fall for fascists and demagogues and plunge the continent into another war. And so very deliberately, they set out to vest supreme power in what they envisaged as a class of sober, sensible, level-headed technocrats who didn't need to worry about what people thought. And that is what's happened ever since. And in a way, it's worked. Right? Monnet and Schuman and the other founding fathers understood from the start that the plan they had, this bold, spirited, ambitious scheme to merge the ancient kingdoms and republics of Europe together into a new single polity, would never work if each successive transfer of power to Brussels had to be referred back to the national electorates for permission. They would have never got to where they are today. The trouble is, that has now led to a situation where public opinion in Brussels is regarded as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a reason to change direction. I will never forget the reaction to the French and Dutch no votes 5 years ago. The results came in, and then we had a session of the European Parliament the next week, and one after another, people stood up to say, people have got it wrong. They didn't understand the question. They must have been voting on something else. Maybe Chirac's unpopularity, or Turkish membership, or some other thing. You know, we need better propaganda. We need better information. They need to be made to understand their true interests. No one accepted the possibility that maybe it was for us as the elected representatives to reflect public opinion, rather than the other way around. And when I stood up and made this argument, the people around me said, "Oh, stop being so populist." And I said, well, gentlemen, what you mean by populism, as I understand you, is doing what your constituents would like. In my country, we call that democracy. It's not the same at all. I said, no, I am beginning to understand this. In Brussels, it's democracy when you get a yes vote, and it's populism when you get a no vote. But there is something eerie about this attitude that says we start from the proposition that integration is an absolute good, and then we cast around for ways to sell that idea to the public, rather than an attitude that says, let's begin with what people want. I'm reminded of those eerie words of Bertolt Brecht, wouldn't it therefore be easier to dissolve the people and elect another in their place? Now, you might say, okay, let's accept that it's an undemocratic system. And maybe there's an argument for that. You know, maybe some of the decisions that the European Union has made wouldn't have been made if they had been left to national governments, prey as they are to the lobbying of special interest groups and protectionist lobbies in their own countries. Maybe there is even an element of truth in that. Maybe the single market would not have happened if there had not been an unelected technocracy to drive it through. But the trouble is, EU legislation does not stop at national borders. Again, going back to our experience, we understood when we joined in the 70s that we were joining basically a trade association with political collaboration added on. So it was about trading, buying and selling to each other, and not having any more wars because we were talking. That was basically how it was seen. Right? We had no idea of the extent to which EU regulations and directives would impact on our domestic affairs. Now, let me give you some random examples of internal issues, areas where I struggle to see any cross-border dimension, but which are nonetheless subject to EU regulation. I am required by EU law to have car seats for my children until they reach the age of 12, rather than discarding the wretched yogurt-encrusted blobs at a much earlier age. I speak, of course, of the car seats, not of the children. Now, some of you might think that that makes me a very irresponsible father. Some of you might think, yeah, it's nothing to do with anyone. But in a way, it doesn't matter which side of the argument you're on. Surely that is an issue that ought to be determined through the democratic mechanisms and procedures of each country. Why does it need to be imposed uniformly on 500 million Europeans? Okay? To open a bank account now in the UK, you have to go through this absurd rigmarole of producing all your old electricity bills and so on. That is the EU's money laundering directive. There was a huge issue at the last local elections about recycling being collected on a fortnightly instead of a weekly basis. People were all furious because their bins weren't being emptied. That was the EU's landfill directive. Now, again, perfectly good arguments on both sides of the issue, but isn't it something that can be determined locally, let alone nationally, rather than at European level? And I could go on and on. The price involved in selling a house because of the European Union's requirement for an ecological survey, the price of a letter depending on a different size of envelope, coming from the European Union's Postal Services Directive. Where is the international requirement to do these things? The European Union does not stop at borders. It presumes to regulate even the minutiae of national laws. Now, I know people sometimes say in Iceland, in Norway, in Liechtenstein, oh, but we've had to have thousands of pieces of EU legislation that we are obliged to implement under the Lisbon Treaty, as it's confusingly called, the EEA agreement. Yeah, it's true. You have had to implement, I don't know, 4,000 pieces of legislation since the early 90s, which is a lot less than the 120,000 that we've had to implement as full members. But you know what? Almost all of those EEA regulations have to do with cross-border trade. They are what you would reasonably expect a supranational authority to deal with. You are not told on what terms you have to employ someone. You are not told how to hold a ladder against the wall. That is, I promise you, a real EU directive. You are not told how long you're allowed to listen, how loud the music can be in the workplace, or how many hours you can be exposed to sunlight at the workplace, which I guess is not a huge issue here, or indeed in the United Kingdom. But again, isn't that something that ought to be left to each national authority? You're not told what you can plant in the ground. You're not told what you can fish from the sea. You are only regulated insofar as you are part of an international trading association. And let me tell you, that is a much happier situation. And with all of the problems that Iceland has had in the last 24 months, I would gladly swap our deal with Brussels with yours. Of course, one thing which, as I understand it, you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, one thing which is absolutely under the control of the EU is your financial services, which leads me to another observation. When the crash took place in Iceland, I am sorry to have to tell you that there was a measure of schadenfreude in the European Parliament. A lot of people in all of the political groups felt that Iceland was getting what it deserved. Their view was that under the EEA, you had had the best of all worlds, that you'd been able to benefit from the single market without paying the associated costs. And of course, I think they had a point about that. I kind of agreed with them. But because I was known in the European Parliament as a friend of Iceland and as a supporter of the Icelandic model, and as indeed one of the handful of British politicians who opposed the Brown government on the debt issue, a lot of my colleagues in all parties were coming up to me with visible pleasure, gloating. Ah, Hannan, your Icelandic friends aren't doing so well now, are they? Ha ha! They're now going to have to join on our terms, and it's about time too. Right? And of course, the short answer, as I now realize, I wish I'd known it then, is to say, but the only bit of their economy that was completely controlled by Brussels was financial services. Well, we know that now. Okay, where do we go next? What's likely to happen? Well, the European Parliament is still under the impression that Iceland is so desolate and desperate and poor that you will join on any terms you're offered. And so last week, we had a debate and a vote on the Icelandic application process, and MEPs decided to attach it to two completely unrelated issues. First of all, the settlement of the debt on the IceSave issue, and secondly, whaling. Where did that come from? It's now conditional on a settlement of the whaling issue. I have to say, I don't think that their optimism will last.